talk about everything I did to make this amp sound the way it does now. Hopefully you like that sound. I'm going to tell you everything I did, including all the, quote, secrets, because there aren't a lot of this model out there. And if you want to roll one of your own, that's fine. It doesn't hurt me. There's a couple of thousand different amp models out there, and I've got little secrets for all of them. So I can give up some secrets for one and still be able to pay my bills. And maybe some of these concepts will help some builders. Maybe these concepts will help some musicians know what to look for in a builder or an amp tech. You can ask questions along these lines of people to kind of sound them out, but don't be like, aha, I gotcha, you didn't know the right answer. What is the capital of Assyria? Be careful when you test a tech. We don't like it, but we also understand that you have to build trust with a client, and the client needs to know that the tech knows what they're doing, and they're not going to sell you a new transmission if all you need is an oil change, etc., etc. So let's start with the really boring stuff I did. Now see the first video on this amp, link in the description below, for all the major problems it had. And one of the first was it had all the grounds made to transformer mounting hardware, and the transformer mounting hardware was just using Kep's nuts on this relatively thin, flimsy aluminum chassis. Now, Fender in the past, in the originals, was using pretty thick, heavy gauge steel chassis, or chassis. That plural always throws me off. And over time, the weight of transformers can deform even the steel in those fenders. So not only did I move these grounds to dedicated grounds with nothing else on them, using machine screws and compression washers on the other side, and Kep's nuts or nylock nuts here with dedicated ground lugs, so there'll be no stress on any of these connections. But I also put these fender washers in beneath the Kep's nuts holding the power transformer in place, which reinforces the chassis in that area, makes it less likely that things will deform, because when metal deforms, it gets loose. So we have very solid grounds. So we have the HT center tap and heater center tap and reservoir cap ground here, where Fender put them. We have the bias ground here, where Fender did it. And we have the AC safety ground. Now, this AC safety ground doesn't necessarily look it, but it is longer than the hot and neutral. And the neutral goes straight to the primary with this bit of heat shrink over that joint, because there was no more elegant way to do that in here, and this is more than sufficient. The hot goes to the fuse holder. Let me get that focused a bit better. The hot goes to the fuse holder. From there it goes to the power switch, and from there the other side of the power switch has the other primary from the power transformer. Both the power switch and standby switch were moved back. They were sticking out from the amp. Fender did it this way, and it's not just nice because it looks nicer or that Fender did it that way, but if these jacks are as close to flush to the chassis as you can get them, or in this case to the panel, then it's less likely to shear off from sticking out the back of the cabinet and getting damaged in transportation, or if the amp were laid down on its rear. You want to keep everything protected by the wood of the cabinet. These three output jacks were replaced with long bushing switchcraft L12As. Technically L11s would have been fine, but the vendor didn't have those, so I'm just not using the switch on these. So they have tooth washers. These are much more solid than the ones that were in the amp originally. And crucially, the negative feedback tap is tied to the 4 ohm secondary, so the amp has the proper amount of negative feedback and is no longer going into blocking distortion and sounding anemic. Now on the output tube sockets, I removed the 1 watt screen grid resistors and added 1.5K grid stoppers and put back new 3 watt 470 ohm screen grid resistors. and they're mounted to the side of the socket rather than above it. So any radiant heat from that tube is less likely to affect the screens. It will still affect these grid stoppers over time, but that's a long period of time, and there's no real current through those grid stoppers. So they will be less subject to heat damage. The screen grid resistors get hot through normal operations, so everything you can do to keep off the added radiant heat is good. Let's see, on that note, you'll notice the proper 100 nanofarad, 100 picofarad cap there on the phase inverter rather than the 10 that came in with. Over in the bias, I removed the 50 volt capacitor that had 54 volts on it. I mean, it's negative 54 volts as the bias supply, but still, it's not like you have something rated for positive 50 volts and negative 54 volts is fine. Whether it's positive or negative, as far as the cap's concerned, voltage is voltage. So it's got a 100 volt here. Instead of the fixed 27K resistor, I've got a 10K trim pot in series with a 4.7K 1 watt. I had wanted to put the larger chassis mounted bias pot in here, but there just physically wasn't room because of various things that are on the other side of this. This has held up well in many, many repairs that I've done on the originals. And there's a little bit of silicone beneath it, just giving it some cushion. So I'm pleased with that. Let's see here. Instead of the big ground bus going all the way across the backs of the pots and soldered to every pot and soldered to every jack, and then attached to chassis here and attached to chassis here, and then a redundant connection here and there just for fun with lots of ground loops. I took all that crap out, and I literally took out and replaced all the pots but this one. This is a tapped treble pot, and they're a hassle to get, and they're not great, but I was able to reuse this one. The other pots, given the low cost of CTS potentiometers versus what I charge an hour, and the fact that it took me 7 minutes to get the old wiring off that old treble pot and get it cleaned up and ready for use, it was a better use of the client's money for me to replace all these pots anyway than reuse what the guy had done before. So it has all new CTS pots. All but one are the values found on the schematic, and I'll show that at a later point. And you can see that I have all the new components added like this very neatly. If that resistor ever needs to get changed, it's very easy to do. You don't have a massive ground bus doing no good and lots of harm. So if you need to change out this jack, you don't have to disconnect everything else. If you need to change out this pot, you don't have to disconnect everything else. Like the Fender originals, this cathode goes to ground here. This cathode and this cathode go to ground here, right here. So I'm replicating what they did on the Fenders exactly. Now these input jacks are going to get changed. The parts will be here Monday or Tuesday. Again, with the thick plastic panels, these short bushing switchcrafts aren't long enough to use a tooth washer, and I find a tooth washer to be crucial. So the long bushing jacks are coming in for that. I've got the old ones in place right now. Everything else has been changed out. This one also did not have long enough of a bushing to use a tooth washer, which is a shame, but I've got it cranked down there, and the thing has got a low enough mass that I don't think it's going to come loose. But when possible, tooth washers are your friends. Eagle-eyed viewers will notice that is a 4.7K mids resistor rather than the 6.8 that is stock. I didn't put that in there because I was out of 6.8Ks. I put that there because I think the channel sounds better with a little bit less mids, just a hair. It's not a major difference. It just makes it feel a little bit more open and liquid, and you'll hear that when you hear the clean bits. Now, before I go to the stuff that people will find more interesting or think is more interesting, the actual changes I made to the circuit, I want to stress that a lot of this stuff, just having really good chassis connections, having no ground loops, having solid grounds, having everything repairable and replaceable, is just as important or more important than a whiz-bang mod. And in fact, a lot of the stuff I did as far as the sound, I could not have gotten away with if I didn't have good grounds and good lead dress. Now, one more thing to point out before I move to the stuff people are going to think is cool. Every hole in this chassis, as it came to me, once I removed the old pots, every hole was jagged and rough and oval with great big shards of metal sticking out. And I strongly suspect that this chassis came maybe with some metric holes, and someone drilled it out for 3/8" holes to accept those old CTS pots. And I think they used one of these, a great big 3/8" bit. Just kind of stick it in the existing hole and turn it on and hope for the best. And to a degree, you can get away with that with an aluminum chassis. A steel chassis, you might torque the entire thing and flip it over or smack yourself in the face with a chassis, depending on the strength of your drill. I have this bit, I own this bit. Aside from the occasional need for woodwork, I don't use this bit very often. In fact, I think I've only ever used it in wood because it is too big, too rough, and the wrong tool for the job for holes in chassis. Let me tell you how I would either enlarge these holes or add a new hole in a chassis. And mine's not the only way, but it is a very good way. Let's say that I needed to add another pot here, and this app did not have a front plastic panel. Well, I would make very careful measurements and mark exactly where I wanted that new hole to go. And then right on that mark, I would use a center punch with one tap of the hammer to make a little precise indentation in the metal, which would help a drill bit and keep it from wandering. And at that point, or even without the hole punch, the center punch, if it had this plastic panel on it, I would then go to a very small, non-flexible, sharp bit like this one, and I would put that exactly where I want it to be. If in this plastic, I would just press against it, which will kind of sink the tip in the plastic a little bit, or I would put it in that center hole location that I'd punched. Center punch. I can't use my words today. And I would start the bit in reverse just to really center it, and then I would go forward, and I would very carefully make a hole, and be a very precise hole right through the chassis. This is aluminum. No problem with aluminum. If it were steel, I might add a slight drop of oil through the process. You can Google all that fun stuff. Anyway, once I have that very small hole, I would then enlarge it with this 1/8" bit, which would center on the existing hole, and usually goes through without any problems or any real tear out on the other side. At that point, I would go to this stepped bit, and this stepped bit does a very good job of enlarging those holes, particularly with aluminum, but it works with steel as well, where each cut is just incrementally larger than the next, and it wants to stay centered. And as long as you have sharp bits, and I replace this about maybe twice a year, I get a new one. They're about $40, pay for themselves. I strongly recommend that you use one of these. And if it was just a matter of going from a metric size to 3/8", it takes very little time at all, and it doesn't take much time if you have to start from scratch. And I see people on YouTube using great big bits like I showed you at the beginning here on amps, and my God, I see them using it on guitars. I want to slap them, especially on a guitar, especially on a thin line or a hollow body or an acoustic. Using a big bit like that is a great way to kill a guitar. Get a stepped bit Or if that scares you for guitar work, get a reamer. Remove a small amount of material at a time. Do it intelligently. Do it cleanly. Don't take a shotgun when you're trying to catch butterflies. All right, on to the stuff people will actually care about. All right, here are the changes in the preamp of this channel. The other channel is pretty much original, though I did replace those SM generic silver micas with some ceramic discs. All the values on the normal channel are exactly those of the vintage amp, with the exception of that 4.7K mid resistor, as I mentioned. On this channel, the previous guy had kept it exactly like the schematic, with two exceptions. Instead of the 0.25 coupling caps here, he'd used 0.022s, thinking that would make the pots magically work better for guitar. And instead of the 1 meg slope resistor in the original circuit, he'd put in 100K, again thinking that would make it better for guitar. What that did was give the stage a lot more gain. And this amp already has quite enough gain, thank you very much. I'll get to that. And the result was his tone controls didn't do very much. It had a lot of gain, would have oscillated on him if he did not have that 2.2 nanofarad cap here, where I've got a 500 picofarad. More on that. Didn't sound very good, was very mid-range heavy, very dull unless you turn the treble all the way up, at which point it was hard. Had way too much gain. Just gave me more questions about what he thought he was doing. I would not have let an amp that sounded like that leave my shop. Better to have it exactly original than have changes which don't help things, and in some cases they hurt things. I don't want to make this a diatribe against the builder so much as a positive thing, and maybe give some information out that will help people understand. Now, if you look at the schematic and you squint, you'll see that it is essentially very much like a Marshall, other than, let's say, they have the cathode follower stage first, and then they have the gain stage, which in the Marshalls before the cathode follower, after that. And then they have yet another gain stage. So it has one more gain stage than, say, a 1987. But it has a lot more gain than say a 2204, which has the same number of gain stages. 2204 also has a cold clipper stage. So what I've got here on what I did is you have the same input, with the exception that the 25 microfarad cathode bypass cap is changed to a 1 microfarad cathode bypass cap. That's a big, important difference. Then on the second gain stage, which is the cathode follower, that's all stock, except I've got a 330 picofarad treble cap, as opposed to 250. Just gives a little bit more mids, a little more chewiness. Back to the stock 1 meg slope resistor, because given the overall nature of the circuit and the weirdness with this fake treble pot here with these two resistors, the 47K and the 10K, you really do want that. It decreases the amount of signal being fed to the bass and mids. And God, this gets complicated because they're using relatively small value pots throughout here. Let me look at the schematic myself real quick before I say the wrong thing on this video. Okay, so their treble pot emulation here is like as if this were a 57K treble pot. The bass pot in stock form with the 0.25 microfarad caps is a 25K linear with 820 ohms to ground. So that's your mids is at 820, and then the bass is 25K. Well, I did a bunch of calculations before I ordered parts, and I figured the best way to make this sound right, or always sound the way I want it to sound, is to keep these 22 nanofarads. These blue Sozos are fine. And I changed the base pot value from 25K linear to 100K linear, and kept the same 820 here for the mids. And that means that when this thing is at 9 o'clock, it is the max amount of low end that the stock circuit would have allowed with these caps. And as you'll hear, there's some very usable stuff with more bass. I'll show that as well. So I think this came out really well. I kept the 250K volume pot, but added another 330K bright cap. The amp does not need a bright cap once the volume gets to about 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock. But that's exactly the same point where the effectiveness of that bright cap starts to go away. And below 10 o'clock, the amp was sounding kind of muted and uninteresting. Pardon me, I'm thirsty. Let me get a sip. So I just added just enough bright cap to make the lower ranges of the volume pot musically useful without being bright. Now, 330 picofarad will seem like an awful lot if you're used to other Fenders, but this is only a 250K volume pot, and so as the resistance goes down to get comparable effects, you have to increase the value of the capacitor. So this is like having about a 70 picofarad cap on a standard Fender, so kind of in between a deluxe reverb value and a twin value, the closer to the deluxe reverb. But because the rest of the circuit does not have the brightness adding that you get in the Fender reverb circuit of the later amps, this doesn't do as much. It just makes it balanced out. The treble pot I left stock. That is the third gain stage, and what it really is a second volume control. It is another gain control, and as you turn it down, highs are dumped through this cap to ground. So it's lower volume, darker, higher volume, brighter, which makes this almost more of a gain and attitude adjustment rather than a treble, though that depends on the location of the first gain pot, as I will show. Now, feeding this, instead of the 100 nanofarad that was stock, which is just a ton of lows, and a channel which already has a lot of drive, which can woof, I decreased that to 22 nanofarad. The same value as these blue Sozos. I just used a Vichy. Wasn't going to order a new $4 cap when I think these dollar caps sound better. If anyone's offended by the lack of a blue in there, get a life. And then that feeds the last gain stage. And on that last gain stage, instead of the 2.2 nanofarad bypass cap across its plate, I put in this 500 picofarad. Keeps it from being hissy, keeps it from oscillating, but it doesn't roll off all the highs. The original value, the 2.2 nanofarad, that was when this was a bass amp. This was a bass channel, and it wasn't a modern concept of bass. It was the Fender. Bass should sound like boom, 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 boom. You know, just kind of like Charlie Brown adults. Wah, 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 wah. So I took that blanket off. This is pretty transparent. It just reduces some hiss and means that you can have lots and lots of gain. It doesn't go crazy. And the last mod I made on this channel was this cathode resistor here for V2B. In stock form is a 1.5K unbypassed, and I changed it to a 10K. Did I do 10K or did I do 4.7? Let's see here. I'm looking through the phone. I believe I did a 10K on that. Let me pause and measure that. I'm red-green colorblind, so the stripes don't help me much. Yeah, 10K. The meter says it actually measures 9.6. Yeah, has that silver band tolerance. So if you want an amp to sound just like this, find yourself a 9.6K. Anyway, You won't hear any difference between 10 and 9.6K in a cathode, but you'll hear a huge difference between 10K and 1.5K. Same way you'll hear a huge difference between 1.5K, 2.7K. I forgot to mention this one. 2.7K was bypassed with 25 microfarad. Now it's 2.7K bypassed with 1 microfarad. This third stage cathode was 1.5K bypassed by 25 microfarad. Now it's 1.5K without a bypass cap. So there's a gain reduction there. And there's a gain reduction by going from the 1.5K to the 10K. So even with that gain reduction here and here, this amp, as you have heard, and we'll hear more, still has a ton of gain. And unless I had sorted out all of these grounds, I would not have been able to get away with that. The stock amp, as it came to me, had gain, but it was muddy, it was unpleasant, uninteresting, and a lot of that had to do with the ground scheme, besides the fact that the bias before maxed out at about 23% idle dissipation. And I've got this one idling about 58% idle dissipation. So I'm very pleased with how this came out. And once the new input jacks arrive, hopefully Monday, I will button it up and put it back in the very pretty blonde head shell. Let's hear this some more.